All right, I got the, looks good.
All right. Well, welcome to Serious Brandy. Very happy to have with us today spirits writer and cocktail historian David Wondrich. David, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. This is a real pleasure.
David is most recently the editor of this tome, the Oxford Companion to Spirits and Cocktails. I got to do a wit view too. David, this is a very impressive book. This is 800 plus pages, 1,500 entries, 150 contributors, which disclaimer, I am a contributor as well. But congratulations on the publication of this thing.
Thank you so much. I mean, it's a heavy lift just to hold it up for the camera. You can imagine putting this thing together. So I'm like deeply relieved in a way that I didn't even know existed. Just to have this thing off of my desk, you know. But it's been a hell of a journey, that's for sure.
So before we dive into it, I just want to give folks some background. Can you tell us a little bit, how did you become a spirits writer? You had a sort of interesting journey, it seems like.
Well, it was kind of, it was one of those things. You live in a place like New York City, you know a lot of people, and there's a lot of people doing a lot of different things. Now, I was an English professor at the time and not very happy with it. This was in 1999. And a friend of mine was working for Hearst magazines, and Esquire needed to have a drink book put up online. And he knew that I liked cocktails. I had a few cocktail books, like a small little shelf of weird old cocktail books that I'd come across over the years. And I was writing about music on the side for the Village Voice and stuff. And that, was proof that at least I knew how to write, not just for academics. So he called me up and said, can you help Esquire adapt one of their old drink books for their website? And I said, no, of course I can't. I'm an English professor. I'm busy as hell. It's the end of the year. I've got papers to grade. And he says, well, we can pay you $3,000. Being a junior English professor, $3,000 is a lot of money. And I was like, oh, yeah, I could do this project immediately, if not sooner. And so that got me into writing for Esquire, the magazine. So basically, I started at the top of the business. I mean, I'm not going to deny it.
Are there parallels you see between, what you comparative literature, lit theory, whatever you were doing, and the spirits writing, or is it just a totally different thing?
Oh no. One of the things they tell you a lot in graduate school, if you're in graduate school for the humanities, is that either you get a good academic job or you're screwed for life. You'll be driving a cab, you'll be, waiting tables, you're never going to get anything. And that's just simply what they tell themselves because they hate their jobs. Because the kind of training I got was in evaluating sources and digesting information, making charts and things like that, and wading through conflicting claims and all that kind of stuff. That's extremely useful, as you would imagine. When it came to trying to work out drink history, I was like, I'll just use my graduate school training here. I'll make a big comparative chart and I'll put everything in an organized way, and then I'll try to get to the bottom of it. I'll figure out who's which source could not be right, which source might be right, and which source I'm just going to have to say there's another story. It's stuff like that. So it was actually really useful. And for a book like this one, I mean, I basically did reading for when I was editing it and writing my own entries, of which I wrote a lot. I did reading in something like 8 languages, of which maybe 2 3 at most I speak well, and the rest I can do enough for research, and I learned that as an academic as well, is just read the damn book, and don't worry
And,
about it.
and how did the Oxford Companion come about? Like, how did that project come about?
Well, when my friend and neighbor, now old friend, because this book took me forever, Garrett Oliver, when he finished the beer one, the editors there asked him, he did a really good job on that one. It's a beautiful book. And he turned his in on time, which I did not. But they asked him, are there any other companions that you think there should exist, that we should turn our sights to? And he said, well, there should be one for spirits, one for cocktails. They thought, well, we'll put those together. And they asked him who he thought should do it. And my name came up and they asked me. And again, I was really reluctant, but finally I worked it out and started in on it. And it turned out I was right to be reluctant, because this took a long time. But, finally it got done.
How did you even approach it? I mean, it's such a huge task.
Oh, well, I didn't make it easier, the task, when I signed up to do it. I signed the contract in 2012, and that was about the peak of my international distillery traveling. I'd been recently to China, to Chile, to Oaxaca. I'd been, to Armagnac and Cognac a number of times. I was like Cognac personality or Cognac writer of the year one year. And so I'd been really traveling a lot. I'd been to Scotland, Ireland, all over, and to all kinds of distilleries. And one of the things I realized is that, Kyrgyzstan, places like that. So one of the things I realized is that it's a really big world of spirits out there, and that most of the very good books that were out there that tried to do what this thing was going to try to do made it easier on themselves by covering familiar spirits in wonderful detail. They really go deep into French brandy, English gin, American whiskey, and maybe a little bit into rum, but they don't really go much beyond that. And it's a much bigger world out there, as you know. And I wanted to bring the edges much closer to the center. So we had full coverage on Baijiu. We had a lot of coverage on other Asian spirits, on Arak. We had palm spirits. We've got fairly extensive coverage on West Africa and Africa in general, South America in a good amount of detail, Central America, Mexico, so we wanted to really cover the rest of the world, and bring in some of these fabulous spirits that I'd been tasting out and about. But that made it harder to approach this thing, as you can imagine. But after a couple years on my own, I brought in my old friend and colleague Noah Rothbaum to be an associate editor. And Noah's good at organizing things like this. And between the two of us, we got a list of entries generated. We used our editorial board for that. And then we assigned them, and that took a long time. It's not 1,500 entries, it's only a little under 1,200, but that's, that's still a lot. And to get 1,200 entries assigned was not easy. There were some that we were still assigning early this year. So it took quite some time. And once the entries came in, I realized that was not the end of things. That was really the beginning of the hard work.
Was there ever a discussion? I mean, one thing I should say, one thing I love about this book, I'm not only a spirits geek, but I'm really a reference book geek. And
Yeah.
I grew up in the 70s and 80s with atlases and almanacs and books of lists, and I love that stuff. But in 2021, when people are much more likely to, consult a keyboard before opening a book, was there any discussion of whether, how this would work or whether it should be online or anything like that?
Well, there kind of really wasn't, because I'm a little I love many things about the internet, and I could not have done this book. We could not have done this book without it in any way, shape, or form. It would have taken as long as the OED, But that said, as a source of quick reference for things, the internet is good for a very narrow, like one sentence top line view, and it's good for an incredibly deep dive. The middle ground is very challenging. You go to Wikipedia and it's like, this is really not, this is giving me government regulations. It's not telling me much about like when this spirit originated. It's just putting together easily found stuff in a handy place. We wanted to give another level of depth, and that I think is where the internet really stumbles, is like informed information. It gives you all the information or it gives you just a tiny amount, but when it gives you, it doesn't do well with information in context, because you get so many different contexts and you don't know which to believe.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a lot of these topics too, if you'd wanted to, you could have just written off the top of your head when you started this project, but you didn't, right? It seems like a lot of research went into even the
Oh yeah,
no, a lot about.
I tried to research everything, and I had to, because I had to put, even for the entries I wrote, we always had to put a little bibliography with each entry. And I gave up my most secret sources. They're all in there, the things I've been holding on to and kind of peeking at every once in a while, and gloating over, look what I found. They're all in there. And that was made me, have to really go over everything. And once all the entries were in, or the bulk of them, I had to get them to all make sense together. And that was really my job. There's only, you really need only one person for that job. You can't have a lot of people doing that. You need one
like
person.
Cross-checking and making sure things were consistent.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, entries can say different things about a topic, but they can't like say head-on contradictory things without us addressing that somehow, and because otherwise the book becomes useless. It becomes like the internet. I've got one person saying this and one person saying that, and I don't know which to believe. So like I said, the analogy I've been using, it's like I had to turn it in from a pack of cats into a pack of dogs. You get a bunch of cats together, they go all over the damn place. You get dogs together, they organize themselves and they're focused. And and then they all go chase after the mailman or whatever. And so we had to kind of get it so it was like a pack of dogs, where each entry was different and individual, but they had to kind of pull together.
And the other advantage of using,
that took years.
Yeah, I'm sure. The other advantage of using real writers as opposed to Wikipedia or bots is you've had knowledgeable spirits writers, and the writing is really good and punchy and does not read like sort of the robotic writing you get on some of these internet sites.
Well, we tried really hard for that. We got some of the best writers in the business, and we were lucky to get them. We've got Dave Broom, we got award-winning all up in one side and down the other. We got Dr. Nick Morgan, who has recently written a couple very punchy books on spirits. His Johnny Walker book is lively, and he wrote a really a very, very witty and amusing kind of introduction to whiskey recently that's that's on the spicy side. And so we had a lot of writers like that. Rosie Schaap, a wonderful writer. We had a lot of really great authorities too. We had, Audrey Saunders to write about a lot of like cocktail development and cocktail theory, and nobody's thought more about that than she has. So we really worked hard on that, and we worked hard on getting it readable. Uh, Technical entries were kind of, we worked with them to get them a little less technical so that they'd still have the information, but would be maybe a little more accessible to general readers or bartenders and people who aren't necessarily working professionally running very large distilleries.
In doing the research for this book in particular, was there any new story or new thing you learned, or several new things that really made you say, wow, this is not what I thought, or this is different?
Well, right after I signed the contract, I went to the British Library. I went over to London and started looking through stuff. And I noticed this little random American distillation book from the 1860s by a guy named McCullough. And I'd never heard of it. And so I checked it out. I had to read it in the reading room there. And I'm looking through this thing, and he starts talking about something he called the American Still, which was a coopered tower with copper plates and with 3 copper plates or diaphragms inside. So it was or 2 copper plates. So it was divided into 3 chambers, and you put the wash in the top, and the steam went out through that one, heating the wash, and then you drop the wash from that into a middle chamber through a side valve, and boiled the alcohol out of it, and then dropped it into the bottom chamber where steam went into the whole device and went up into the middle chamber through a manifold. This already sounds ridiculously complicated, but it's actually very simple, but I'd never heard of it at all. And it turns out to have been the standard American still through most of the 19th century, particularly used for rye whiskey, used also for California brandy, used also in Germany, used in the Caribbean, and just an absolutely crucial piece of information that I had never heard of at all. And I thought I knew everything about rye whiskey, and it turns out I knew nothing. Another thing about rye whiskey I discovered while studying German corn, Korn, which is the grain spirit made there, that corn is traditionally distilled on a mash. So you've got grain and water in the still. I'd always thought that was the main difference between American distilling and European distilling. And the Scots always made fun of the Americans for distilling on a mash instead of a wash, where you've strained the grain out. Turns out it was a German thing. We got it from the Germans. American whiskey making has heavily German origins, which had been hidden partly during World War I think. But there's no great history of rye whiskey, and rye whiskey was the German style, and Pennsylvania rye, all those people were Germans or most of them. And so there's a lot of stuff like that just what I'm completely wrong about this, and now I know that I'm going to be wrong about half the stuff I wrote about in this book, and I'll find stuff a few years from now and I'll have to rewrite the whole thing. But yeah, it's not. There's a lot of information out there now.
I mean, one of the things I thought was interesting, I don't know if this was new in the book or not, but I had never heard this. I had always heard that the original Sazerac cocktail was a brandy cocktail made by Handy or Boucher.
Yeah.
And you seem to say no, that there was brandy and bitters cocktails, but Sazerac was always a whiskey cocktail.
Yeah, the Sazerac cocktail as a Sazerac cocktail called the Sazerac cocktail served at the Sazerac bar only goes back to about 1890. They always made cocktails there. They made brandy cocktails at that bar in New Orleans, which goes back to the 1840s. They made cocktails out of Sazerac brandy, but they stocked 3 or 4 other kinds of brandy too. And they stocked various kinds of bitters, and they never had a famous house cocktail until they started selling bottled cocktails in the late 1890s. And their most famous one, their most popular one, was based on their whiskey cocktail. So and there's ultimately, I did so much research on this. I went through so many newspapers, and for up until the 18 until really 1895, there is no mention of such a drink at the Sazerac, and the place collapsed and reopened. It was rebuilt. It moved. It split. Every possible, it closed. Every possible opportunity for a journalist to say, "I'll sure miss those Sazerac cocktails." Nothing. It's absolute crickets. And after a while, you finally got to say, the dog isn't barking because they ain't got a dog. And that was the conclusion. It's the only conclusion I could come to, because there's just no evidence.
So sorry, Brandy lovers, the Sazerac was not our cocktail.
Well, the improved brandy cocktail, which goes back to the 1860s, is pretty delicious though, and it's the exact same thing. That's the other thing. The Sazerac is nothing but Jerry Thomas's improved whiskey cocktail, made fancy by rinsing the glass with absinthe, which they invented in New Orleans. You never hear about that anywhere else, and at the Sazerac bar. So it was that final absinthe rinse that that made it. But other than that, it's really the style in which the drink is built that makes it a Sazerac. And you could do that with brandy just as well, and it's just as tasty. So
we can still do it, even if it's a historical anachronism.
Yeah.
What, given that this is serious brandy, are there any other brandy things that came up in the book that surprised you?
Well, I did a lot of reading in French 19th century distilling books, and especially ones that focused on brandy, because I'd read Leo Cullen's history of the brandy trade in the Ancien Regime, in other words, before the French Revolution, which is an amazingly detailed book and a very interesting book. A little confusing on the production side because Lewis Cullen is maybe not a distiller, but still like full of distillation stuff. And I wanted to see how that played out, because according to that book, cognac really didn't achieve its modern form as a spirit before the revolution. It wasn't made exclusively by a double distillation in a pot still. It was like 1.5 distillations, and it was cut down to proof not with water but with the tails of the distillation, which gives you a pisco-y funkiness. And modern cognac doesn't have that. I personally like modern cognac the way it is. I've also been fortunate enough to taste pre-phylloxera cognacs, and not in overwhelming numbers, but in significant numbers. And they really don't taste much different from modern cognac, which is interesting. So sometime in the 19th century, it took its modern form, and I wanted to see how that developed. I was flummoxed to find pictures of stills in use in cognac and diagrams of stills in use in cognac in the 19th century that are completely insane. They've got all these like wild pieces of plumbing and chambers inside chambers and steam heat, and it was just absolute chaos. Every house had their own style of still that they bought from patent still manufacturers, and there was no regulation on that at all. That seems to have come in the 20th century. So really, like, the modern cognac only really comes in much later. That doesn't mean the cognac that was made tastes wildly different, but it was a different product, and it could be a different product. And now it really can't be. It's very hard. My friend Alexander Gabriel is always trying to bring back some of these old techniques, which are so fascinating. And some of them are completely legitimate and were a big part of cognac history, like aging in chestnut wood barrels, for instance. Uh, and he has a hell of a time with the BNIC over this. And because they are determined to keep a cognac very narrow, because the BNIC is, it's largely controlled by the four large companies that have a huge amount of investment in cognac being exactly what it is today, no more and no less. So and I see their point, but the modern whiskey industry has kind of shown us different. And doing the research on the 19th century cognac industry, that would show you differently as well. In the supposedly great days of pre-phylloxera, they were using chamber stills. They were doing all this crazy shit. It's really very amusing. And it's like, I would love to have been able to tour cognac distilleries in like 1860. That would have been really something.
Do you think there's more sort of myth and legend around spirits and cocktails than there is around sort of other categories you've dealt with?
Well, probably more than around beer, but I don't think anything tops wine, for myth and legend. And there's a lot of just fairy dust and woo in the wine world too. I mean, and the spirits world, there's a good deal. There might be more. I don't know. If I say something stupid about the wine world, I would regret it. And so I'm not going to. But there's just a lot of myth and legend, definitely in the spirits world. And partly it's marketing bullshit, I guess. But partly it's legitimately, nobody really knows a lot of this stuff. Companies have changed hands so many times. They've forgotten their own histories. Most of them don't have historians on staff to dig into this stuff. That's an expensive luxury. Only the biggest companies do, and they've got the most sunk in things being more or less as they are now. So it's tough. But I know people will come to me and ask me for the real history on their products, and and not just to me, but to others as well. So there's some interest in it, and I think we can do better at digging into it now than we could 20 years ago, because of the availability of things like spirits trade magazines that you can see digitally now, and you can go through the advertising and you can find dates of products that don't match up with the dates that you've been taught, that the company believes. I mean, I can give you a great example from gin. Plymouth gin is an ancient gin, but they say 1796. Doing a bunch of research, working on the Plymouth, checking the Plymouth entry, that Alan Katz wrote a great Plymouth entry for us. But I found out that, in fact, in 1800, there's an announcement that a distillery just opened to make Plymouth gin. And so it's in a different spot from the building they say that they'd been in since 1796, which in fact was not making gin at that time. So there's a bunch of stuff like that. It's a few years here and there, but eventually these brands often struggled for a long time, or were just local. Only once they started trademarking things and putting things in sealed factory bottles, they had to have something to write on the bottle. And it's like, when did we start making this stuff? Well, it was, my grandpappy's day, and I think he probably started around 1796 in the old distillery, but it turns out that was the medium distillery because there was an older one. There's a lot of stuff like that. And it wasn't until branding that this stuff became important, because before that, spirits were very much sold like olive oil is sold or something like that.
Right. Who would bother with the
Yeah.
history, right, of how it happened? I mean, it's
You
funny.
sold it, but you sold it by the barrel, and merchants bought the barrels and blended their own, or said, "Hey, this is a particularly nice one I have here. Why don't I fill you some bottles of that?" You know, and that was it. There were no materials that came with it. There's no advertising campaign.
I mean, there's even a surprising amount of confusion about relatively modern brands, it seems like, and a
Oh
lot of
yeah.
it is marketing, but about, you think about Bullet Bourbon or Pappy Van Winkle and all the stories about
Oh my God.
their origins. But say for Plymouth, I mean, I assume, like, you're right, that they weren't trying to fudge 4 years from their origin.
No,
They just didn't know, or
I think they
didn't care.
legitimately didn't know.
Right.
The Coates, it was Coates and Company always. It took me a week and a half to find the name of Mr. Coates. You know, there was just this guy who was an investor, and not at the very beginning. He came in a little later, and then, you know, he was a hands-off investor, and then he died, and they agreed to call it Coates and Company because he was the biggest investor, and that was it. There's a lot of stuff like that. It gets really, you know, it gets really complicated.
And that's, I mean, that's why it helps to have this. I mean, you know, very few people have taken sort of an academic perspective on spirits in the past, right? I mean, I feel like you sort of started that in some ways.
There are, doing this book, I realized there's more academic research out there, but the problem is it's all in little individual silos. I read a couple great books published in Mexico on the history of rum in Mexico, which turns out to be really long, goes back to the 1500s, and rum was very important in Mexico up until the 19th century, and you know, probably mid 19th century, when it became a thing, when agave spirits became favored, because there was a big move towards native culture, you know, and valorizing native pre-Columbian Mexico. And so agave, pre-Columbian, maybe not, maybe spirits, maybe not. That's still a very vexed question, but certainly there were agave drinks, and rum definitely came in with the Spanish. So, but they still make a lot of very good rum in Mexico, like really very high quality, and a lot of very shitty rum. But the high quality stuff has a, you know, a really old tradition, going back, like I said, to the 1500s, early 1600s, made in the same kinds of weird archaic stills that they make some mezcals in. You know, with they use they used to use bull's hide fermenters, like they still use for some mezcals, and all this like really old old Mexican stuff. And so these books like are fascinating, but they're unknown, you know, outside of a very narrow field. And I found that over and over. There is a book of that's very useful. It's never been translated, and it's just not it. What we really need is more intermediate books like the Oxford Companion, where people are able to go into the scholarly literature such as it is and present it for a general audience and synthesize it and weave it together. In wine, there's a lot of that stuff. There's very little in spirits. I mean,
Yeah,
I
well,
have
know
no, go ahead.
I was just going to say, no, in Brandy, a lot of us, you know, hunt down one of your contributors, Charles Neal's old Armagnac book, which has been out of print for 20 years, but is
I
still
know
the best book out there.
I've got that one too, and you know, that's it. You know, there's Lewis Collins' book. There's our late contributor Nicholas Faith's book. There are a few others, but there aren't a lot. A lot of them are just either very shallow kind of top line history or specialist books, and the stuff in between is what we really need. Is stuff that like a serious person could build an education on. Put it that way. You know, that it's not just repeating a few simple things, but that's giving you some context and some depth.
One of the things that you have that there's a lot of in the book, aside from spirits production and cocktails, is bar culture and bartenders. And I know you have an interest in that, going back at least to your book Imbibe. And I'm wondering what you think. I mean, we've had this huge, COVID has been this huge disruption.
Oh,
Right, to
yeah.
everything, but certainly, I mean, to bars, it must be the biggest in the US since Prohibition, and who knows worldwide. What do you think the effect of the pandemic is going to be on our drinking, on bar culture, on all of that?
It's, you know, I hate predicting the future because I'm always wrong, but I think it's safe to predict that there is going to be an effect. I'm seeing more home bartending. People are, people are going out to bars now, but not carelessly or easily like they used to. And I'm talking about mostly top cocktail bars here, mostly in the more careful parts of the country. In other parts of the country, it's nothing has happened. I was in Pittsburgh, the bars were packed. I wasn't there. I wasn't in them because it scared the shit out of me. I'm sorry. I hope it's okay to curse on this because
It is absolutely fine.
Okay, good.
We're all adults here.
Yeah, good. But it in places where they have really developed cocktail culture and lots of bars, it's definitely closed some, and I think it's a lot of those drinkers are pretty sophisticated, and a lot of them adapted to home mixology pretty seriously. They spend a lot of money on spirits. I know I sold more copies of Imbibe last year, and of my bar gear line that I have with Cocktail Kingdom. It was a banner year for that stuff, which meant that people were home and they wanted a drink. So
well, you were helping with your Twitter series, right?
That certainly that helped draw people in for sure. That was that got a lot of views because people were desperate for a drink and the bars were closed. I mean, we'll see how this plays out. The Prohibition generation learned how to mix drinks, and they mix drinks for the rest of their lives. Those are people who always knew how to make a martini or a Manhattan or an old fashioned, had no problem shaking up a daiquiri at home and all that stuff. And yet they supported bars too. And that's my suspicion of what's going to happen. The bars might be a little less crowded, but you're going to get a slightly more informed clientele who might be a little more skeptical of some of the weird and outlandish cocktail mystification that was going on. But we'll see. But I think we're going to have a lot more people mixing drinks.
Well, I think one of your entry, I think it was on Cocktail Renaissance, sort of said the modern cocktail renaissance ended in 2019 or something like that with the onset of the pandemic. And I don't know if
yeah, I mean,
it's just
it kind of, I don't know if it's definitely one way or another. It's a changing point, I mean, I guess you can, if you're drawing lines under eras, you could draw it under there for sure. That doesn't mean we're all going back to woo-woos and fuzzy navels and stuff like that, although I do see a little bit of that as nostalgia, but I always see stuff like that. However, it's definitely going to change. I mean, the priorities are going to be different. The priorities that when I started doing this, the priorities were, can we get like fresh ingredients? Can we get a bartender that knows how to put enough vermouth in a Manhattan and things like that? And we've pretty much got that. So now what are the issues now? I don't know. I mean, partly there, can we get the right ventilation in this place so we can drink in here safely? There's stuff like that. Can we build a safe bar?
Right?
Uh,
Is there another, virus mutation that's going to make us stop going to bars for another 6 months?
exactly. And so there are going to be different issues. Also, we're having huge arguments, and rightly so, about equity in bars and about who profits and exploitation and bar culture and representation and things like that. And those are things that need to be discussed. I mean, those are problems that have been simmering for a very long time. And
And those issues obviously go way beyond bars and touch every realm of not only spirits and cocktail world, but the whole world, but they come up all the time. And I'm thinking rum or the tiki world. How did you instruct people or handle that in the companion, those types of issues?
well, we've tried to be way more inclusive from kind of on a foundational level, in that we've got coverage of all the continents, maybe not Antarctica. Okay, fair enough. But and we tried to include their stories in all of our stories, so it's not just in the spirit stories. It's not just, well, they make peach brandy and they made peach brandy in the United States. They also make it in South Africa. You got to make sure to mention that, and there's a lot of stuff like that. That it's just, is there another perspective on this that we're automatically shutting out? If we only write about European brandy making, for instance, or so that's part of it. History of bartending. I've been, and this was forced on me by research, by finding what I found. I've been trying to include African American bartenders in the history of bartending for a number of years, for a very long time now, because they're a huge part of it. They're integral to the early development of American bartending. So those people had to be included. We've been, there's a lot of stuff like that. We just tried to make sure that it was in there as a matter of course, that it didn't get a separate diversity entry, because it's baked into the other entries. I mean, that was our strategy. Whether we succeeded, I can't say, or to what degree. Obviously, things like this are always a process and could always use more work. But at least it started, and it's a part of the book, like on a fundamental level. At least that was what we tried for, to just tell all the stories.
Were there any that were particularly troublesome to tell, or that were controversial and you had disagreements over?
Well, yeah. Lem Motlow is a name you might be familiar with. It used to be on every bottle of Jack Daniels. Proprietor Lem Motlow was on when I was a high school student in the 70s and a college student in the 80s, and it was always on the bottle of Jack Daniels. It was Jack Daniels Old Number 7, proprietor Lem Motlow, Lynchburg, Tennessee, population 170, I believe it said. I think I probably looked at a lot of those labels. Lem, it turns out, in 1920, he had a whole lot of whiskey in Missouri because he had moved the distillery there, which is part of the Jack Daniel's story that's not generally known, that they closed in Tennessee and moved to Missouri. And he went there to look at his barrels, which he wasn't allowed to sell because it was prohibition. And he drank way too much in speakeasies and got in an argument with a black Pullman car porter, and refused to let this person tell him anything. He was singing loudly and being disruptive, and he wouldn't let himself be quieted by a person of color. So he pulled out a gun and tried to shoot the guy, shooting instead a white conductor who came up to help. shooting him dead on the spot. He was acquitted completely by an all-white jury because he said the black Pullman car porter had laid hands on him, which he had not. So that's a story that had to be in there. There's stories like that are just, they're there and you can't really step around them. I mean, if you find them, you've got to tell them.
Was that something that the publishing company didn't like, or was there some issue about you're including it at all?
No, there wasn't. All these things are fully sourced. We've got extensive newspaper coverage on this. It's true, unfortunately. It's not unknown, and it's widely reported at the time.
Is it something Jack Daniels has ever commented on, or Brown-Forman?
Not commented. I think it's in one of the histories. It's glossed over a little bit, but very, very quickly. But it's a very sordid story, and the newspaper's reading is quite something. Yeah.
So you talked earlier about all of these global spirits that you did talk about in the book, some of which we don't really have at all in the US or even Western Europe, palm spirits. What of all of those which ones should we be trying, or are there a few we should be?
Palm spirits are really, really interesting to me because they're very old. They go back at least to the first millennium AD, and probably could very well be older than that. When made well, they can be quite delicious. I have a fabulous bottle of Philippine Lambanog that's just this lovely, clean, bright spirit. They can also be kind of funky. And they're made in a huge belt that goes through pretty much the entire tropics. Mexico used to make them and still might, going back to the 1500s. They all through India, all through Southeast Asia, all through Micronesia, etc. And so, and they're usually made from the sap of the trees. West Africa has a history of it, and it's really interesting. And I would love to see a little more of that available, because that stuff is cool and tasty and historic. There are definitely others. I'd like to see more corn out of Germany, more of their grain spirit, because I've had some very good ones. It sort of fills a gap between Irish whiskey and maybe between vodka and Irish whiskey. It's very light, but it's got a nice grain flavor, and some are a little more strongly flavored than that. It's very cool.
Anything in the brandy or fruit spirit category that we're not?
Well, yeah, there are. Well, American peach brandy is. Let me talk about that for a couple minutes. American peach brandy is not a spirit that the English knew when they came here. The settlers in Maryland and the Carolinas found peaches growing wild along the coast. It was not a Native American plant. Those were growing there because the Spanish had planted them in Florida before mostly giving up Florida. And the Native Americans had taken the seeds and the peaches and eaten them and planted them or tossed them aside all up and down the coast. And they had taken root and found incredibly fertile soil and perfect growing conditions. And they were just everywhere. The early settlers of Maryland fed their hogs on peaches because there was nothing they could do with them. They couldn't preserve them. And peaches are very delicate. They don't last long. By the 1650s, they were distilling them. And at first, the spirit had a nasty reputation. By the mid 1700s, it was the most expensive spirit made in America or made in the Americas. It was barrel aged. It was carefully distilled from the peaches, often with the pits cracked in there for an extra nuttiness. The Marquis de Lafayette, when he went back to France, wrote several times asking for peach brandy. It was, peaches are a lot like grapes or even apples, I suppose, in that they're a very juicy fruit, but there's not like a great depth of flavor. So once you distill it and put it in a good wooden barrel, it really becomes all about the barrel and the maturation. And it's a thing where it's a cellar master's art. And you could see that I haven't had an American peach brandy that's older than 2 years old right now, but even at 2 years old, you could see that already happening. You could see that becoming just this very rich, clean, full and fruity, but not cloyingly so, not heavily peachy. The peach flavor is very subtle and is something that kind of grows on you. You really see the potential for a really great American brandy, and a truly fantastic one that is our own completely, and that would be cool.
What happened to the peach brandy? I know you've written about this before. What happened to the peach brandies?
Well, it was always expensive to make, and in the 1830s and 1840s, American whiskey grew up and got better, and so suddenly that became a challenge. And whiskey is made from grain that you can store the year round. Peaches you have to distill at the farm. You couldn't really ship them then. They didn't have refrigerated cars or anything. So that was a problem. Another great problem is it was a Southern spirit, and the labor situation in the South after a bit of unpleasantness changed greatly in the 1860s. With the end of the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation, there were not people that you could force to grind peaches, at harvest time. There just wasn't the labor for this, and that was a big problem. There were parts of the South where they still made it, parts of Kentucky, the eastern shore of Maryland's eastern shore and of the Chesapeake, but it was mostly gone by then, and you don't see it sold in the North anymore. The advertisements disappear. I went through 60 years of newspaper advertisements for peach brandy to try to figure out what the hell happened to this stuff. And you saw it was consistently the highest priced spirit for sale, highest priced domestic spirit for sale from the 1780s through the Civil War. That's a pretty long run. And then it keeps the high prices, but availability disappears.
It just that reminds me, it seems just like a lot of the histories of these spirits are recorded in advertisements or price lists and things like that.
Oh yeah.
Like as opposed to, is that one of the main sources you've been able to learn about spirits
It's
from?
a really useful source if you if like me you went to graduate school and have learned complete self-abnegating patience, because oh my God, is it fiddly work. Day after day you go through newspapers and they have these things called price currents where they talked about the prices in the local market of various commodities. And it's like, okay, what's peach brandy selling at today? And then you make long charts and lists, or you can use databases, of course, but that means you need two computers, or you got to keep switching back and forth. It's easier to do it on paper, frankly. I think, because there's not a lot of ways you could sort this stuff. So it's just, price, where, price, where, price, where. date, and eventually you start to see patterns, but it's really painstaking work, but it's incredibly useful. And advertisements the same. What the selling points are for these spirits, any information that they think is going to help sell the spirit. That's very interesting. And also, of course, prices there too. And that really gives you, I mean, the economics of it is very important. And we tried to put a lot of economics into our basic spirits history, at least work it in. It's like why things happen. Usually because of money.
Well, that's true. I mean, that's a lot of things a lot of the spirits we take for granted only exist because they were done for financial reasons, right? Whether it's putting spirits in barrels or.
Yeah. Oh, rum is the greatest example. Rum is almost surely created. There are no records of the birth of rum in the New World. There was plenty of sugared spirits in India in the Old World, in the 1200s, 1300s, 1400s, and probably a good deal before that. But in the New World, rum starts in Portuguese and Spanish America, and it was made from the skimmings that you got as you boiled down cane juice to reduce it to the point where it crystallizes. Hot, nasty work. And there's all these impurities rise to the top and have to be skimmed off. There was no market for those. You couldn't sell them. So the plantation owners gave some of them to their cattle and some of them to their enslaved workers. And that was the sweetener that enslaved workers got, was skimmings. They made a fermented drink from it, and they distilled from it. At the same time, sugar on the small sugar farmers learned that you could also distill from fresh cane juice. If the people who were growing cane for the large sugar mills, but didn't have sugar mills. The people who had the sugar mills had sugar mills. All the cane went into the sugar mills. And then the juice got boiled down, the skimmings they gave to their workers, the sugar they sold, and the molasses they sold, which is the stuff that drips off the sugar after it crystallizes. There were markets in Europe for both sugar and molasses. There was no market for skimmings. So this is in Spanish America up to the 1600s. Then the British come into the Caribbean and they say, you can make spirit out of this stuff? Now, the Spanish and the Portuguese had big domestic spirits industries making grape brandy at home. And those were paid monopoly prices so that they didn't have competition from the New World. England didn't have anything like that. So they said, the planters who were in Barbados said, the skimmings, no, you don't get those. We're going to keep that spirit and we're going to sell it to North America, to the colonies up north, which they did. So they took what had been the enslaved people's share of their labor and turned it to profit for nothing. It cost them nothing. Labor, you needed a distiller, and you needed a still or a couple of stills. So there's some capital investment, but they used slave labor, and the materials were industrial waste. So
Is it likely then
that was the birth of rum.
Is it likely that the inventors of rum then were enslaved workers on those plantations?
Oh yeah, but plantations in Brazil, in Peru, in Central America, Mexico, in the Spanish Caribbean. It was because it came to the know-how came to Barbados from the Dutch, who got it from the Portuguese. So and then the British, once they started making this stuff, they invested heavily in it, including doing things like adding molasses to the skimmings and then adding spent wash or dunder to this stuff, and they improved the product greatly because it was a profit-making product, not just something that the enslaved made for themselves. So they invested heavily in the business and plowed profits back into it because it turned out to be very profitable. So, I mean, the economic history of rum is the part that is the least glamorous, and nobody really talks about this in, you know, in the kind of the spirits world, but there are very large and very important books have been written on this, and in the academic world. So again, we kind of need these bridges to bring the, you know, some of the economics in, and also the academics don't know a lot about distilling, and they don't know a lot of what people in the spirits world know. So they're not looking in the right places for a lot of things. So I think, you know, it'd be profitable to have a conversation between the two.
Well, your book probably goes a long way toward doing that.
Well, I don't know if a long way, but it's an attempt to start that conversation in a lot of cases. You know, it's we got 160 writers working for that. So little evangelists going out everywhere, I hope.
What, now that you have this behind you, what's up next for you? Do you have any projects in the offing?
Well, I'm already in the middle of another book because this one took so long. I had to start the other one, which is the comic book story of the cocktail. So it's it's basically a graphic novel history of the cocktail, going
That
back to
sounds
the
great.
beginning.
Or do you illustrate, or?
No, I'm not illustrating it. No, I'm just doing the you know, the words and the structure. But it's crazy. It's very different, and I'm well into that one. So hopefully that'll get finished, and I'll be happy about that. But eventually, I'd like to take a crack at doing a book length history of the global spirits trade, because there isn't one. You know, and for general readers, not an academic book.
That sounds really interesting. I'm sure there's a lot there to write about.
I mean, I have a great model. This book I bought at random at Foyles in London, in their used book section, is called The Wine Trade, and it's by this guy Warner, written in the early 1970s. One of the best books I've ever read. It's about the English wine trade. It's detailed, it's clear, it's witty, and the guy has real points of view, you know, and it's like that's exactly what I think we need, you know, is a book like that goes back to the beginning, is like, how did spirit drinking and distilling spread, not as like alchemy, but as a business, you know, as something that people do all the time, not as this weird kind of I don't know, mystery, which is how it's usually treated the early days.
That sounds great. Well, thank you so much for joining us, David.
Well, thanks, Steve. I mean, this is great. It's great to talk to you, and I'm so happy to be doing this, and, you know, have a really interesting conversation about this stuff.
And I'm going to pretend like I'm a real show host and hold up a copy of the book again.
Bless you.
$57 on Amazon, highly recommended, but I'll give you a warning that if you buy this, it will ruin your weekend or first week, because it is really hard to put down, and it is really easy to go down rabbit hole after rabbit hole, because every entry connects to some other entry, and then that entry connects to something else. But it is a lot of fun to read through and do that with.
Well, bless you. I'm glad our field of rabbits strategy worked. You know, it's like, that's exactly how we wanted it to be used, and I'm glad that's what it's doing, and I'm glad you're enjoying it. That means a lot. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks for joining us. Take care.
Take care. Bye. Bye.